Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to enter into a new chapter, Chapter 9, on Reproduction and Development. I'm Miss Delia, and if you're ready, let's get started with the lesson. So in this chapter, we have 4 subtopics, and in this video, we'll focus on the first one, which is sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Now, this is just a quick overview of what we will go into in this chapter, but basically, we're going to learn what are the reproductive organs in plants, how they develop their female and male gametes, and how fertilization can occur in flowering plants. And here are the learning outcomes. I hope that by the end of this lesson, you would be able to state and define the terminologies involved in this chapter, explain the development of a pollen grain and formation of male gametes, as well as explain the development of ovules, embryo, sac, and formation of female gametes, and last but not least, explain what is double fertilization in the formation of seed. Now, these all may seem very complicated, but as we go through the chapter, I'm sure they'll seem more and more sensible, and I hope that you would be able to remember them after this. Before we go into the nitty-gritty bits of it, I would like to kind of go through very quickly what is reproduction and development. Okay, reproduction, we can say it is the process by which new individuals are produced, and usually when we learn this in biology, we focus a lot on sexual reproduction, but as you can see down here, there are 2 types of reproduction. There is asexual and there is sexual reproduction. Development is the progressive changes that take place throughout the life of an organism. So dari pesenyawaan sampai kepada dia menjadi satu organisme yang lengkap. Okay, in other words, tumbesaran. Okay, that is development. It is referring to the growth process. And the roles of reproduction and development is for the continuity of life. Okay, kita ada pesenyawaan, kita ada tumbesaran adalah untuk memastikan kita dapat terus hidup. Terus ada zuriat, terus ada kehidupan di dunia ini. So that's basically it. Okay, so that is a very quick definition. And now we're going to focus on the parts of the main points of this subtopic, which is talking about flowering plants. So I said in this video you would learn about the reproductive organs of flowering plants. So in case you don't know already, the reproductive organs of angiosperm plants or flowering plants are the flowers. Jadi bunga-bunga yang kita nampak di taman itu adalah reproductive organ untuk tumbuhan. Okay, they are generally comprised of 4 floral organs or modified leaves. Dia ada 4 komponen, okay, 4 organ pada satu bunga itu. And some of them are sterile flower organs, which means they don't produce the egg and the sperm. And some of them are the fertile flower organs, which means these are the ones that will produce the spores, or we can also say it is the egg and the sperm. Okay, so let's look at those 4 floral organs. The first floral organ is the sepal. Okay, that's this part. It's the green part that protects the flower petals before it blooms. The second part is the petal, which is this part. As you know, it is the flowery, colorful one. The third floral organ is the stamen. The stamen is this. It consists of the anther and the filament, and the carpel. The carpel is this. It consists of the stigma, style, and ovary. The tips of the flower stalk that bear the flower parts is known as the receptacle. So receptacle yang menampung keseluruhan bunga ini. Sambungkan dia kepada tumbuhan. Okay, so we're going to go into each of these organs. We'll focus more on the carpel and also the stamen. So we'll look at ladies first. Ladies first is the carpel, the female reproductive organ of the flower. So how is the structure? The carpel, or we can also call it as a megasporophyll, has an ovary as its base and a long slender neck called the style and a stigma at the top. So the stigma is a sticky structure that captures pollen. It is this part at the top that you can see on the flower. The style is a neck-like structure through which the pollen tube grows. Later you'll learn what is a pollen tube, but basically what you see here, this long part that looks like a neck, is the style. And the ovary is the structure that will contain one or more ovules. And that is this part. If it is fertilized, the ovary will become a seed. Ovaries will ripen into fruits, which will often carry seeds by wind, water, or plants to new locations. Now let's look at the male reproductive organ of the flower, which is also called the stamen. A stamen or microsporophyll consists of a stalk called the filament and a terminal structure called the anther. So the filament is the stalk ataupun tangkai yang menampung anther. And anther is a pollen-producing structure within which are chambers called microsporangia or pollen sacs. So these are the anther. There are several anthers and filaments that you can see in this diagram, but I just circle one of them. And in this anther is where we will produce pollen grain ataupun debunga. Okay. Just now, we were only talking about the male and female organs in the flower, but we haven't talked about the gametophytes, okay? The male and female gametophytes of the flowers, in the male, it's called a pollen grain, okay, which will form within the pollen sacs of anthers. Okay, ini adalah anther. Di dalam anther ada pollen sac. Dalam pollen sac akan terhasil pollen grain ataupun digelar sebagai debunga. And the female gametophytes, which are embryo sacs, will form within the ovules in ovaries. So this is an ovary. Inside is ovule. Inside ovule is female gametophyte called embryo sac. And this is a cross-section of an anther. And we are going to learn about how those male gametes will be formed. So if you're ready, let's begin the process of learning how a male gamete looks like. Okay, so first thing you need to learn about a male gamete is it is contained in a microsporangium. Apa itu microsporangium ataupun pollen sac? It is a sac in the anther of a stamen, and each sporangium contains microsporocytes. So kalau kamu nampak perkataan sacs, S-A-C, okay? S-A-C ataupun banyak dia S-A-C-S, dia bermaksud kantung. Okay, it is a kantung ataupun satu bag yang mengandungi sesuatu. So microsporangium is the kantung yang akan menghasilkan debunga, pollen grain. Yes, tapi sebelum dia digelar sebagai pollen grain, dia mengandungi satu sel yang digelar sebagai microsporocytes, which is a diploid cell. And also pay attention here, it uses the word micro. Asalkan bahagian yang jantan digelar sebagai micro. Okay, so here, circled in the diagram, are the microsporangium. Inside the microsporangium are microsporocyte ataupun kita boleh gelar dia sebagai microspore ataupun microspore mother cell. These are diploid cells that divide by meiosis and thus producing microspores, haploid. And this in here is the microsporocyte. What is produced next is the microspore. It is a haploid cell. It will develop into a pollen grain. Another word that you should learn here is the tetrad. A tetrad is a group of 4 microspores that form from meiosis of microsporocyte. So masa microsporocyte menjalani meiosis, dia akan hasilkan 4 biji microspore. Bila 4 biji microspore itu duduk sama-sama, kita panggil dia sebagai tetrad. Okay, so that is a tetrad. Now we are talking about the pollen grain. Dari tadi saya cakap pasal debunga, inilah bentuk debunga ataupun boleh digelar sebagai male gametophyte. The pollen grain consists of a male gametophyte enclosed within the pollen wall. Pollen wall, dia ada dinding dia, maksud, okay. And the pollen wall will consist of exine, which is outer layer, consists of sporopollenin, which give protection, and the intine, which is made of cellulose and pectin and gives strength and shape to the pollen grain. Okay, part ni tidak berapa hafal, tidak apa. Yang penting kamu tahu dia ditutup oleh sesuatu dan sesuatu itu ada mengandungi dua lapisan yaitu exine dan intine. Inside of the pollen grain, we will have two types of cells. The first type of cell is a generative cell. Okay, it is a generative cell of the gametophyte that will divide and form two sperms later. Kalau kita tengok dalam gambar raja ini, dalam ini, okay, this part that I have highlighted in pink is the generative cell and the generative nucleus. In the black and white diagram, it is the part that I highlighted in purple. The tube cell is also known as a vegetative nucleus. So this is the second cell that is contained in the pollen grain. And this tube cell will produce the pollen tube. Okay, so ini dalam the first diagram, this part highlighted in blue is the tube cell. In the black and white diagram, the part highlighted in green is the tube cell. Kadang-kadang ada buku yang akan gelar dia sebagai vegetative nucleus, ada buku yang akan gelar dia sebagai tube cell. So, as you know by now, the pollen grain is a 2-in-1 structure. Okay? Dia ada memang dua jenis nukleus di dalam pollen grain. Okay, so this is what pollen grains will look like under the microscope. Okay, memang kalau kita tengok dia di bawah mikroskop, kita akan nampak dia punya bentuk pollen wall. Okay, berapa kerasnya, so that it can only germinate under the right conditions. If it's not the right conditions, the pollen wall will make sure that the cells inside are protected. Okay, so that is it about the structure of the male gametophyte. Here are the terminologies. You can look at this later at your own time. And now we are going to go into the female part of the flower. We are going to talk about the embryo sac. So in the embryo sac, we learn about this structure called a megasporangium. Megasporangium is the ovule of the plant that will contain megasporocyte. So untuk cakap di mana mulanya megasporangium, ada buku yang kurang jelas. Ada buku yang merujuk kepada keseluruhan ini sebagai megasporangium. Ada buku yang merujuk kepada bahagian yang light blue itu saja sebagai megasporangium. Tapi ingatlah dia ini adalah satu kantung yang mengandungi megasporocyte. Remember just now I mentioned that if it's a male part of the flower, we use micro. Well, in the female part, we will use mega. So jantan, micro, betina, mega. So this is the female part. Inside megasporangium is megasporocyte, or we can also call it as the megaspore mother cell. It will divide by meiosis and produce 4 megaspores. 3 of the megaspores will degenerate, only 1 will survive and give rise to a female gametophyte. So this is the megasporocyte. Now let's talk about the megaspore. The surviving megaspore, which is a haploid cell, is the one that will give rise to female gametophytes. It will undergo 3 times mitosis without cytokinesis to form cells with 8 haploid nuclei. So this one that I have circled in red is the surviving megaspore. And it will undergo first time, second time, third time mitosis to form the cell with 8 haploid nuclei. Now, in each ovule, we will develop the ovary, which develops in the ovary, will contain a female gametophyte known as an embryo sac. Ini yang terhasil daripada 3 kali mitosis tadi, tanpa cytokinesis, dia akan bentuk ini, female gametophyte. So, this embryo sac or female gametophyte will consist of antipodal cells, polynuclei in the central cell, synergids, and the egg cell. So, let's talk about each of these cells in the embryo sac. The first is the antipodal cell, which sits at the opposite end of the embryo sac and are 3 antipodal cells of unknown function. Apa yang kita maksudkan di sini adalah antipodal cell ini ada fungsi dia, cuma kita tidak tahu apa fungsi dia sekarang. So these are the antipodal cells. The next type of cells in the embryo sac that we'll talk about is the polar nuclei. The other 2 nuclei called the polar nuclei are not partitioned into separate cells, but they share the cytoplasm of the large central cell of the embryo sac. Okay, so these are the polar nuclei. So dia adalah dua nukleus yang mengongsi satu cytoplasm. Okay, and the third cell in the embryo sac is the egg cell. This is a haploid egg cell located in between of the synergid cells that form the zygote when fertilized. So this is the egg cell, the yellow colored one. And last but not least are the synergid cells. They are two cells called the synergids that will flank ataupun dia duduk di sisi egg cell itu, di kiri dan kanan egg cell. They will help attract and guide the pollen tube to the embryo sac. Okay, so these are the synergid cells. The function is to attract and guide the pollen tube to the embryo sac. So once again, these are the terminologies. You can read these in your own time. Those were talking about the structure of each of the female and the male gametophytes. Now we'll talk about how they are formed. Kita cakap pasal pembentukan pollen grain or development of the pollen grain. We'll focus on the male one first for now. So the development of the pollen grain and the male gametes begin in the anther. In the anther are the pollen sacs. And within the pollen sac are microsporocytes, which are diploid. And each microsporocyte will divide by meiosis to become 4 microspores. So here by meiosis, your microsporocyte will divide and become microspores. Each of these microspore will divide once by mitosis and then produce 2 cells, which are the generative cell and the tube nucleus. So daripada sini, setiap 4 microspore itu, dia akan mitosis dan menjadi pollen grain. And then the generative cell will eventually form the sperm, but it doesn't form now. It doesn't form now, meaning that sekarang dia masih digelar sebagai generative cell. Nanti baru dia akan menjadi sperm. Okay, the generative cell in the pollen grain eventually forms sperm, and the tube cell in the pollen grain will produce the pollen tube, which will later deliver the sperm to the egg. This two-celled structure is encased in a thick resistant wall known as pollen grain, immature male gametophyte, and it will only become a mature gametophyte when the generative cell divides by mitosis to form 2 sperm cells, which is during pollination. Okay, so bila kita cakap pasal development of pollen grain and male gametes, kita memang cerita sedikit pasal apa itu pollen grain. Tapi kamu perlu ingat bila dia pollen grain, dia belum lagi matang. Okay, dia adalah gamete yang belum matang. Dia cuma akan matang sepenuhnya semasa persenyawaan plants. Persenyawaan plants adalah semasa pollination. So which is over here in the diagram when it lands on the female part of the flower. Okay, so that is it for the formation of pollen grains and male gametes. Kalau kamu diminta untuk explain, kamu boleh ikut teks yang diberi dalam bahagian ini. Alright, so that is it for the male part. Let us go on to the development of the female gametes, or in the full title, it is the development of ovule, embryo sac, and the formation of female gamete. So this development will begin in the ovule, and each ovary will contain 1 or more ovules. Each ovule will contain a megasporocyte. These megasporocytes will divide by meiosis to produce 4 megaspores. However, 3 of the megaspores will degenerate and only 1 megaspore will survive. Okay, so this is what we touched on previously when we talk about the structure of the embryo sac. So megasporocyte, divide, dia akan jadi megaspore. Daripada 4 megaspore itu cuma 1 yang akan survive, yang 3 lagi akan mati ataupun degenerate. So what will happen to the 1 surviving megaspore? The surviving megaspore will divide by mitosis 3 times without cytokinesis to form embryo sacs with 8 haploid nuclei. And in this embryo sac of female gametophyte, it will consist of the 2 synergid cells, 3 antipodal cells, 2 pollen nuclei, and 1 egg. So this is what we talk about when we say the structure of the female gametophyte tadi. Cuma masa kita mau explain dia punya development, kita nyatakan semula. And with that, the development of the ovule, embryo sac, and the formation of female gamete is complete. Dia sampai sini, dia lengkap sudah, dia mature sudah. Sekarang kita akan cakap pasal apa yang berlaku bila yang jantan dan betina berjumpa, iaitu double fertilization in the formation of seed. So this thing about double fertilization, it's unique to flowering plants. Tumbuhan yang berbunga saja yang akan ada double fertilization ni, and it will give a bit of disadvantage to the plants, okay? Dia akan memberikan kelebihan kepada tumbuhan yang flowering plants. We'll talk about more of that later. Let us first learn what is double fertilization. Apa itu double fertilization? It is the union of two male gamete cells with different nuclei of the embryo sac. So, akan ada dua male gamete dan dia akan bergabung dengan dua nuclei yang berbeza. Itulah double fertilization. The first fertilization is when one male gamete fertilizes the egg to form the zygote. Okay, so that happens down here. The second fertilization is when the other male gamete will fuse with two pollen nuclei to form a triploid nucleus, and that happens in the middle of the cell here. Okay, so that is the double fertilization. It ensures that the endosperm will develop only in the ovules where the egg has been fertilized. Kenapa perlu ada double fertilization? Supaya endosperm hanya akan terbentuk bila telur sudah dipersenyawakan. Okay, kalau tidak, nanti dia akan membazir zat. It will prevent the angiosperms from wasting nutrients in eggs that lack an embryo. Okay, so let us learn about the step-by-step process of what happens for double fertilization. Okay, first step, you need to let your pollen grain arrive at your stigma. So, bunga itu boleh disebarkan dengan berbagai cara, boleh juga disebarkan oleh angin, disebarkan oleh air, disebarkan oleh kumbang-kumbang dan sebagainya. Tapi yang penting, bila pollen grain sampai kepada stigma, baru kita mula proses double fertilization. When your pollen grain lands on a receptive stigma, that's when we begin the fertilization process. When it lands, the pollen grain will absorb the moisture and sugar solution on the stigma and then germinate. Okay, dia akan bercambah. So, bila dia sampai di sini, dia bercambah. The tube nucleus will produce a pollen tube that will extend down the style towards the ovary. Which one is the pollen tube? I am going to highlight it in this diagram over here. So you could see over there, the green color, that is the pollen tube. So this pollen tube will grow down the style and around the ovary, and it will go towards the integument. Kamu ada nampak di diagram tadi, ada part yang kena label sebagai integument. Itu adalah satu lapisan. Lapisan yang melindungi Megaspore rangium. Dan di sana akan ada satu kawasan yang macam nipis sikit yang kita gelar sebagai micropyle. As it is going down, the generative cells will divide by mitosis to produce two male gametes. Okay, sambil pollen tube itu menurun ke bawah, akan itu male generative cell will divide by mitosis to produce two sperm or two male gametes. Boleh gelar sebagai sperm, boleh juga gelar sebagai male gametes. And then the pollen tube will enter the ovary through the micropyle and discharge two male gametes within the embryo sac. Okay, so micropyle adalah satu kawasan pada integumen yang nipis sedikit yang pollen tube boleh masuk. So pollen tube masuk, dia main kasih pecah saja dinding. Okay, bila dia masuk, dia akan keluarkan dua male gametes yang dia bawa tadi. Male gamete pertama akan pergi di sini. Okay, one male gamete will fertilize the egg to form the zygote, and the other male gamete will combine with the two pollen nuclei to form a triploid nucleus. So yang di tengah-tengah itu akan jadi triploid ataupun 3N nucleus. Okay, so this is the zygote in yellow. This is the triploid nucleus in the middle. This large cell in the middle will give rise to the endosperm. which is a food storing tissue of the seed. And this zygote will give rise to an embryo, which is diploid, and that will become your new plant. The ovule will develop into a seed. So this region is called the ovule. This part becomes seed. And outside here, which is not shown in this diagram, is the ovary. The entire ovary will develop into a fruit containing one or more seeds. Jadi kawasan luar ini adalah ovary dan dia akan membentuk buah yang kita makan. Isi buah yang kita makan. Near the time of double fertilization, the tube nucleus, the other synergid, and the antipodal cells will degenerate. Selepas ataupun lebih kurang masa double fertilization tu, tube nucleus, synergid cell, antipodal cell akan perlahan-perlahan reput. Itulah bila kita makan buah, kita tidak nampak sudah ketiga-tiga jenis sel ini. Okay, so the final product of that double fertilization process will produce the seeds. The seeds will have embryo, seed coat, and endosperm. Dan seed ini akan bercambah bila dia sampai ke kondisi yang sesuai, dia akan bercambah dan menjadi tumbuhan baru. Okay, so that is pretty much it for the formation of seed through double fertilization. So just a very quick summary, I kind of sped through the lesson, but in this lesson we talk about the structures of the male and female organs in the flower. We talk about how the male gametes can be formed, how the female gametes can be formed. We also describe the name of them in each of the process. So nama dia pada setiap step itu, term-term dia yang kamu perlu ingat ada di sini. And we also talked about double fertilization. So I have linked to a video here. If you find it a bit difficult to visualize what I've talked about, you can refer to this video. Okay? Boleh tengok video ini nanti untuk dapatkan gambaran yang sesuai. So in this video, we are looking at how the different male and female parts of the flower are going to lead to double fertilization. So do have a look at this video later. So this is a good long video. I hope that you'll have the time to look at it yourself later. I hope it is beneficial for you. And what should you do now? Ito saja untuk 9.1, very quick lesson. After this, I will send you a quiz to pre-test or sexual reproduction in plants quiz 1. Now the video is not yet uploaded, but I will let you know when the guided drawing video is uploaded. But in the meantime, you can proceed to step number 3, which is tutorial question for chapter 9, structure, part B, question number 1, which is for plants. So that is all from me. Thank you very much for bearing with me through this quick lesson, and I will see you again soon. Thank you and bye.